Hello. Surveys have shown that for people who no longer practice their religious faith, often the reason given is the idea that there's a conflict between religion and science, and they have chosen science. The thinking is that religion was used to come up with answers when there was no science. One of the things that we have to look at as people of faith is how do we answer people when they say they've chosen science over religion? How do we show that there's no conflict, that truth is truth? As we do that, we can help them understand that there's no reason to reject religion and spirituality in place of science. What is faith? One good explanation is found in Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the realization of what is hoped for and evidence of things not seen. So we can see that faith is not for what can be seen. For instance, you don't need faith to know where you are right now or what color clothing you're wearing. One of the things that people will say is that I will believe in God when it can be proven that He exists. When this is said, it's usually meant that when you can prove through the physical sciences that God exists. But let's take a look and take a step back. We can look back in our history and see that there have been things that we could not prove, but later we were able to prove through the physical sciences. But they existed even before they were proven. The fact that they could not be proven did not mean that they did not exist. Let's look at gravity. Isaac Newton discovered gravity and even came up with the formulas that showed how fast something would fall from the air based on the forces of gravity. But gravity existed long before Isaac Newton discovered it. Let's look at another example, quarks. Their existence has been proven by the Large Hadron Collider in Europe. Yet Einstein, many years earlier, said that something like quarks had to exist because of the way that he observed that molecules interacted with each other. So Einstein, through what he could observe, knew that something like quarks had to exist, even though it could not be proved that they existed. Then, many years later, their existence was proven. We have to understand that quarks existed long before they could be proven. Let's look a little bit into the future. Dark matter. Astrophysicists have said that dark matter has to exist even though we don't know how to describe it yet. We can't prove that it exists. But through observances, we can see that it has to exist for the universe to behave in the ways that we see through the physical sciences. Just because something cannot yet be proved through physical sciences is not sufficient to know that it does not exist. Let's take a look at God. So this idea of knowing that something can exist based on what we observe and not necessarily what can be proven through the physical sciences. Thomas Aquinas has given us 5 proofs of God. These are proofs based off of what we can observe and not necessarily through the physical sciences. They are the argument from motion, the argument from efficient cause, the argument from contingency, the argument from gradation, and the argument from design. I won't try to go through them all, but let's take a brief look at the argument from contingency. If you see a flower that's growing, how did that flower come into being? The seed started growing when it came into contact with rain that made it start growing and continue to grow until the flower bloomed. Well, where did the rain come from? It came from the humidity in the air, and when the humidity got too high, the water fell in rain droplets. So where did the humidity come from? It came from the heat that hits rivers, lakes, and oceans, and it drives liquid water up into the air. Next logical question is, where did the heat come from? It comes from the energy of the nuclear reactions in the sun. And so then you can ask, where did the sun come from? And that came from an agglomeration of matter that through gravity brought it all together, and the sheer mass started the nuclear reaction. And where did all this matter come from? Well, that came from the Big Bang, where all matter in the universe originally came from. The idea here is that everything that we see on Earth and in the universe is contingent on something else being there. The flower doesn't exist without the rain. The rain doesn't exist without the humidity. Humidity doesn't exist without heat from the sun, and so on. But ultimately, that's an argument that is not compelling, because everything cannot continue to go backward for its cause. There has to be something or someone who had no beginning and was not contingent on anything else, who had no yesterday. And that is God. By his very nature, he had no beginning and was not contingent on anyone or anything else. Let's take a step and look at how science and religion are not opposed. In the 1950s, it was illegal to teach evolution in our public schools. Only biblical creation could be taught. It was only in 1967 that the Supreme Court ended this prohibition. So what about the church? In 1950, Pope Pius XII said that we cannot dismiss the theory of evolution. It answers many of the questions that we see and observe. He said the theory has merit. What's the takeaway from this? The church was not scared that science contradicted the creation story found in Genesis, even when our secular legal system could not accept the science. Decades later, Pope John Paul II addressed the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, a body established by the Vatican to promote the sciences. The task of the Academy was to serve the truth. Pope John Paul II said there should be a fruitful dialogue between the church and science, and he spoke about the origin of life. He said there can seem to be a clash between scientific discipline and divine revelation. This is the presumed conflict that we see in the surveys. But our Pope said that there cannot be a contradiction because truth cannot contradict truth. He was quoting his predecessor, Leo XIII. The Church can better expand her work with scientific knowledge. Science can help us to better understand what we can observe in our physical world. Pope John Paul II also stated that the Church discerns moral behavior. Science cannot do that, as it's outside of its realm of knowledge. He spoke about evolution and said that there is no conflict with evolution and our religious faith. Evolution touches on the concept of how our physical body came about. That does not deny that we are created in the image and likeness of God. Our body comes from living matter, but our soul is created directly by God. So we see in the spiritual realm that science observes and measures, but the spirit cannot be observed in that way. Our religion helps to clarify what science has observed. I want you to look at this picture that was taken at the Solvay Conference in the 1920s, bringing together most of the world's renowned scientists. On the right, you see Albert Einstein, but in the middle was Father Georges Lemay, who was a leading astrophysicist and also a Catholic priest. He was the first person to calculate that the universe was still expanding and going ever outward. He's also the first person to theorize the Big Bang Theory on the origin of the universe. Get that. When people say that science and religion are opposed, say that a Catholic priest is responsible for the huge scientific Big Bang theory. Einstein looked at what Father LeMay wrote and said, "Your calculations are correct, but your physics are atrocious." You might think that LeMay would say, "Einstein disagrees with me, so maybe I should rethink my proposals." But he didn't, and he knew that his science was good and sound. His work was later agreed with by Hubble of the telescope fame, and then later Einstein told LeMay that this is the most beautiful and satisfactory explanation of creation that I have ever listened to. What's the conclusion? Father LeMay saw no conflict between science and religion. We should feel confident when we talk to people and say that there is no conflict between science and religion. Science and religion are not in competition. One doesn't lose when the other advances. Science and faith are both seeking the truth. There is no need to choose one or the other. God bless you.